The Rock humiliated by Black Cashier at bakery store, but instantly regrets it. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. It was a quiet autumn morning in October 2018, the kind where the chill in the air wrapped around the streets of Los Angeles like a comforting blanket. Rock, the beloved Hollywood actor known for his humble and kind demeanor, stepped into a small bakery tucked in the corner of a busy avenue. He had no entourage, no airs, and no expectations of being recognized. But what happened next left him stunned and set off a chain of events he would never forget. As Rock approached the counter, the warm smell of freshly baked pastries filled the air. A young cashier, Tasha likely in her mid-20s, glanced at him with a faint smirk. Tasha had a sharp tongue, a quick wit, and a habit of sizing people up instantly. Perhaps it was his worn leather jacket, his slightly unkempt hair, or the simple way he carried himself that made her think he was just another customer, not one of the most admired stars on the planet. "Hey," she said, her tone tinged with condescension. "What's it going to be, coffee and a day-old muffin? Or is that pushing your budget?" The store went silent. A few customers turned their heads, some out of curiosity and others in disbelief. Rock blinked momentarily, taken aback. He wasn't one to seek confrontation or make a scene, but there was something about the sting in her words that struck deeper than it should have. For a moment, he simply smiled as if trying to brush off the tension. "I'll take a black coffee and, what would you recommend?" he asked, his voice soft, almost disarming. But Tasha wasn't done. "Recommend? Oh, sweetie, this isn't Beverly Hills. Everything here is cheap enough for you to afford." She quipped, her laughter cutting through the air like a sharp knife, unbeknown to her. One of the bakery's regulars, a middle-aged man named Joe who'd been sitting by the window, recognized Rock immediately. Joe knew of the actor's history, his acts of kindness, his generosity, and his resilience. Despite the tragedies in his life, unable to stay silent, Joe stood up. "Tasha," he said firmly, his voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. "Do you know who you're talking to? This man is The Rock." Tasha froze, her smirk faltered, but her pride wouldn't let her apologize just yet. Instead, she crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "So, what's he doing here, slumming it?" Joe shook his head, visibly disappointed. "You don't get it, do you? This man has more humility in his little finger than most of us have in a lifetime, and you just humiliated him over a cup of coffee." The tension in the room was palpable, but Rock, ever the gentleman, stepped in. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "We all have bad days." But Tasha's face had begun to change. Regret flickered in her eyes, mingled with embarrassment and something deeper, an unexpected pang of guilt. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words wouldn't come. And that's when Rock did something that no one expected. Rock reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the counter toward Tasha. His eyes, kind yet piercing, met hers as he quietly said, "For the coffee. And please keep the change." The bakery went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the coffee machine. Tasha stared at the bill, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of shame and confusion. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to take it or shove it back at him. "Why would you?" she began, her voice unsteady. But Rock interrupted, his tone soft yet unwavering. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to reach every corner of the room. "She had the same fire in her, the same pain." Behind her words, Tasha's lips parted slightly as though she wanted to respond, but she couldn't find the words. Her co-workers, who had been standing silently behind the counter, exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something deeper unfolding. Rock continued, his voice calm but filled with something raw and unguarded. "Her name was Rachel. We were kids when we met. High school sweethearts, actually. She used to work at a diner not too different from this place. She had dreams bigger than the stars, but carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. The small crowd in the bakery hung onto every word, their coffees forgotten, as the story unfolded. Tasha's defensiveness melted, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. What happened to her? Tasha asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rock looked down for a moment, his fingers gently tapping the counter as if searching for strength. Life, he said simply. She had a hard one. Lost her mom when she was young, worked 2 jobs to keep herself afloat, and just when it seemed like things were finally getting better, she was diagnosed with cancer. I stayed by her side for as long as I could, but he paused, his voice cracking slightly. She passed away at 23. Too soon. Way too soon, the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. A few customers dabbed at their eyes, and even Joe. The man by the window stared at the table with a solemn expression. Tasha swallowed hard, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. I'm sorry, she managed to say, her voice trembling. I didn't know. Rock offered a small, bittersweet smile. How could you? But here's the thing. Tasha Rachel never let the world make her bitter. She fought like hell, even when the odds weren't in her favor, and she taught me something I'll never forget. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. Tasha's eyes welled up, and for the first time she felt the full weight of her actions. The smirk she had worn so confidently just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a genuine sense of remorse before she could respond. Rock added, "It's never too late to choose differently to be better for yourself and for others." The sound of a small sniffle broke the silence, and Tasha realized it had come from herself. She quickly wiped at her face, embarrassed but unable to stop the tears from coming. But Rock didn't linger. He picked up his coffee, gave her a small encouraging nod, and turned to leave. Just before he stepped up out the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "I hope you have a good day, Tasha." He said, his voice warm and sincere. "And remember, you're stronger than you think." As the door closed behind him, the bakery remained silent, every person lost in their own thoughts. Tasha stood frozen, her hands gripping the counter as tears streamed down her cheeks. She couldn't explain it, but something in her heart felt different, lighter yet heavier at the same time. And as she watched the Rock walk away down the busy Los Angeles street, she made a quiet promise to herself, a promise that this moment would be a turning point, that she would never let her pain or pride overshadow her ability to show kindness again. Little did she know, this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Tasha couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Yunk words echoed in her mind. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. She replayed the moment over and over, the quiet strength in his voice, the way he didn't lash out or humiliate her in return. She felt like a fool, a cruel, thoughtless fool, and the regret gnawed at her like a dull ache. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual, her heart restless. She decided to head to work an hour early, something she'd never done before. The bakery, still dim and quiet, smelled of rising dough and brewing coffee. She wiped down the counter with shaky hands, her thoughts spiraling as the sun rose. She noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under the tip jar. It hadn't been there the night before. Curious, she opened it and her breath caught in her throat. It was a handwritten note. "Tasha, I see more in you than you probably see in yourself. Everyone carries something heavy, but it's how we use that weight that defines us. Don't let it make you small. Let it make you strong. I believe in you." There was no signature, but she knew exactly who had written it. Her knees felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair, clutching the paper like it was the most precious thing she'd ever held. How could someone she treated so poorly still offer her such grace that day? Tasha couldn't bring herself to snap at a single customer, no matter how rude or impatient they were. It was as if Keanu's words had planted a seed in her heart, one that refused to let her return to the person she had been just 24 hours earlier. But fate wasn't done with her yet. A week later, just as she was beginning to find her footing in this newfound kindness, the doorbell of the bakery jingled and in walked Rock again. This time he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman, perhaps in her early 40s, with a quiet grace about her. Her short-cropped hair and deep-set eyes gave her the appearance of someone who had weathered storms, but refused to let them define her. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. Tasha froze behind the counter, her breath hitching. She wasn't sure if she was more nervous or grateful to see him again. Rock smiled gently, as though sensing her unease. "Hey, Tasha," he said, his voice as calm as before. "This is Angela. She's a close friend of mine and runs a nonprofit that helps young people get back on their feet. I thought of you, and I wanted to introduce you." Angela stepped forward and extended the flowers toward Tasha. Rock told me, "You're someone with a lot of potential." She said warmly, "I'm always looking for passionate people to join our team. If you're interested, I'd love to talk." Tasha's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. The weight of the moment was too much, the kindness, the faith they had in her, the chance she didn't believe she deserved. She took the flowers with trembling hands, her voice breaking as she said, I don't know what to say." Rock gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it for the rest of the day." Tasha worked with a renewed sense of purpose. Her heart lighter than it had been in years, she kept Angela's card in her pocket, running her fingers over it every now and then, as if to remind herself it was real. But life wasn't ready to let her off so easily that night. As she walked home through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, a sudden memory surfaced, a memory of her mother, who had walked out on her family when Tasha was only 8 years old. The abandonment had left scars that no one could see, but they shaped everything. Her anger, her defensiveness, her belief that no one ever stayed. And now here was Rock, a stranger who saw her differently. A stranger who offered her a chance to rewrite the story she'd been telling herself for years. But could she take it? Could she trust that it wasn't just a fleeting gesture, destined to fade like all the others? Tasha stood on the doorstep of her small apartment, the flowers still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't go inside right away. Instead, she stared up at the stars, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "Please don't let this be another thing that leaves." What Tasha didn't know was that Keen wasn't done changing her life for days. Tasha couldn't bring herself to call Angela every time she stared at the card. Fear gripped her heart. What if she wasn't good enough? What if this was just another moment of hope that would crumble like all the others? But something about Keanu's quiet confidence in her wouldn't let her throw the card away. Instead, she tucked it in her journal, promising herself she'd reach out when she felt ready. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. Tasha was cleaning up the bakery after closing. The soft patter of raindrops on the windows made the world outside feel distant and quiet. She was wiping down the tables when the door jingled unexpectedly. Startled, she turned, expecting a late customer instead. Rock stood there, his hair damp from the rain and his leather jacket glistening with droplets. "You're still working late, huh?" he asked, his tone light yet warm. Tasha blinked, caught off guard. "We're closed," she said, though her voice lacked its usual edge. "I know." Rock replied. Stepping inside, he held up a small paper bag. "I figured you might not have had dinner yet." Tasha stared at him, her throat tightening. No one had ever brought her dinner before. Not like this. Not with such genuine care. She took the bag without a word and sat down, unsure of what else to do. Rock pulled out a chair across from her, his presence calm and steady. "You know," he said, leaning back slightly, "I've been where you are, scared, unsure, thinking, I didn't deserve good things." Tasha's fingers tightened around the bag. That's hard to believe," she murmured. Rock chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, life has a funny way of humbling everyone. My dad left when I was 3. My best friend died when we were barely adults. And my daughter?" He paused, his jaw tightening. "She was stillborn. Her mother passed away, not long after." Tasha's heart sank. She hadn't known any of this to her. Rock had always seemed like a man, untouched by the harshness of life. Yet here he was, sitting across from her, bearing his soul. "I could have let it break me." He continued, his voice soft but resolute, and some days it felt like it did. "But I learned something important. The pain doesn't have to define you. You can choose what you do with it. You can let it make you bitter, or can let it make you better." Tasha's eyes welled up, but she refused to let the tears fall. "Why are you telling me this? Because I see something in you," Tasha. Rock said, his gaze steady, "and I think you see it too. Even if you're afraid to admit it, you're not just some angry cashier in a bakery. You're more than that. You just have to believe it." Tasha swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. "I don't know how," she whispered. Rock leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You start small. You call Angela. You take one step, then another. And when it gets hard, because it will, you remember that you're not alone. You've got people rooting for you, even if you don't realize it yet. for the first time in years. Tasha felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt since she was a child, hope as Rock stood to leave. He placed a small envelope on the table. "Open it when you're ready," he said with a smile before walking out into the rain. Tasha stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. Inside was a handwritten note, just like the first one, but this one included something more. "Every story has a beginning, middle, and end. Don't let this be where yours stops. Call Angela." And beneath the note was a check enough to cover the first 3 months of rent if she needed to take time off to start anew. Tasha's hands trembled as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because of the money, she was crying because for the first time someone believed in her enough to invest in her future. That night, she sat on her bed staring at Angela's card. Her phone lay beside her, the screen glowing faintly as she hesitated. Could she really do this? Could she let herself hope again? Finally, with a deep breath, Tasha dialed the number, and as the phone began to ring, she felt a shift deep within her. A small but powerful promise that no matter how hard it got, she would keep going. The phone rang twice before Angela picked up, her voice warm and reassuring. "This is Angela. How can I help you?" Tasha hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hi, Angela. This is Tasha from the bakery. Rock said I should call you." The pause on the other end was brief but filled with understanding. "Tasha," Angela said gently, "I've been waiting for your call. I'm glad you reached out." That simple response broke something in Tasha. It wasn't judgmental or patronizing. It was welcoming for the first time in years. Tasha didn't feel like a burden. Angela invited her to the nonprofit office the next day, and Tasha nervously agreed. She spent the rest of the evening preparing herself, replaying Keanu's words in her mind. When the morning came, she stood in front of her mirror for what felt like hours, trying to convince herself she belonged there at the office. Angela greeted her with a hug, catching Tasha off guard. "Your family, now," she said, simply, her eyes full of sincerity over the next few weeks. Tasha threw herself into work with Angela's nonprofit, a group dedicated to empowering young adults who felt overlooked or underestimated. She worked tirelessly, learning how to manage programs, mentor others, and most importantly, forgive herself for her past mistakes. Rock would occasionally stop by to check on her progress, always bringing something small, a coffee, a book he thought she'd like, or even just a kind word. Each visit reminded her of how far she had come and how much further she could still go. But the most surprising moment came one evening after a particularly grueling day at work. Tasha had stayed late reviewing applications for a new program they were launching just as she was packing up. Angela walked in with a knowing smile. "There's someone here to see you," Angela said, stepping aside. Tasha turned and froze. It wasn't Rock. This time it was her mother. The woman she hadn't seen in nearly 15 years stood in the doorway, her hands trembling as she clutched the strap of her purse. Her hair was streaked with gray, her face lined with age and worry, but her eyes were unmistakable. "Tasha," her mother said, her voice cracking. "I know I have no right to be here, but I heard about the work you're doing and I just had to see you." Tasha felt the air leave her lungs. She had spent years hating this woman, blaming her for everything that had gone wrong in her life. But now standing face to face with her, she saw something she hadn't expected. Regret. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me." Her mother continued, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But I'm so proud of the woman you've become." Tasha's chest felt tight, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to turn away. But instead, she stepped forward and pulled her mother into a hug. The years of pain didn't vanish in that moment, but they softened just enough to let her heart open a little. Rock arrived at the office the next day and found Tasha sitting outside watching the sunset. He sat beside her, his presence as calming as ever. "I met her," Tasha said softly, not needing to explain who she meant. Rock nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "How did it feel? Complicated," Tasha admitted. "But good. I think I needed it more than I realized." They sat in silence for a while, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Finally, Tasha turned to him. "You didn't just help me. You changed my life." Rock looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You changed your life, Tasha. I just reminded you of what you were capable of as the sun dipped below the horizon. Tasha felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. She wasn't defined by her anger, her mistakes, or even her past. She was a woman with a future, one she was finally ready to embrace. And as Rock stood to leave, he gave her one last piece of advice. Never stop choosing kindness. Tasha, not for anyone else, but for yourself. You deserve it. Tasha smiled, watching him walk away for the first time in her life she believed up.